We're continuing our exploration of the scaffolded code that was generated for us based on a class in our entity data model. And in this lesson, I want to talk about how the HTML form was created, as well as all of the input controls in that form. So the form tag, as well as all the input tags as well. Now, we'll get to that in just a moment, but let me just kind of remind you about some of the helper methods that we've looked at from the HTML helper class up to this point. Way back, I think when we were looking at the index.cshtml page, there were two methods that we were looking at: a display for method and a display name for template in the index.cshtml. And what that allowed us to do was to define display templates that would be used every time a given data type was utilized in our view model. And essentially that would allow us to define how we want a given data type to be rendered or emitted out to the end user, whether it be a certain set of HTML tags, CSS classes, or even some JavaScript functionality added to a given form tag. And at that time, I also said there's an edit for helper method that would allow us to create edit templates. So we have display templates and edit templates, and they do the same thing just for input control. So I gave the canonical example of the date time data type. Anytime it's used in our application, we may want to utilize a jQuery calendar plugin that has rich functionality everywhere there's a date time property from our view model and the code that's generated as a result of that. Now, we're here in the create.cshtml page, and there's obviously going to be some input, so it's a good time to talk about the form and input controls. And you know, as you take a look through lines 10 pretty much to the end here, there are a lot of references to the HTML helper class and its various methods, and it looks a little bit unseemly. I mean, there's a lot of complexity. You see a lot of lambda expressions and things of that nature here. And you might be wondering to yourself, well, why couldn't I just hard code all of the HTML code that I need to generate a form? And you certainly could. But remember, the value of the helper methods on the HTML helper class is that they utilize core pieces of the MVC framework in order to emit the correct HTML and CSS and JavaScript for our model. And that could utilize data annotations, it could utilize routes, and then other core features as well. So that's why we want to kind of continue working with the HTML helper class. All right, so as we look through the code here, you'll notice at the very start in line number 10, as I pointed out a moment ago, there is an HTML.begin form. So what that probably does in my mind is that it creates the form tag. But notice that it's wrapped with a using statement. In fact, it's a using and then an open curly brace, and that closed curly brace doesn't happen until way down here on line number 40. So essentially everything inside of here is inside of a using statement. Now, that using statement has two purposes in C#. The first, as you'll recall, and you know this already, it's to include a namespace in a file to reduce the amount of typing required to specify a type in the .NET Framework class library. So whenever we take a look here, we don't have to type out any of these full names for these classes that are in these namespaces. We can just use the using statement and say, hey, you know, you'll find any classes that are in this namespace, right? And any classes that are in this namespace. So that is the first way in which a using statement can be used. But the second use of a using statement is to enable something called the iDisposable pattern, iDisposable. And so the using statement makes it easier for developers to work with disposable objects by automatically disposing of them when the flow of control leaves the scope. So after this line and we continue on processing, then we can dispose of the object, in this case the form, the HTML form object, and move on. Now, you might be wondering, well, what's a disposable object? Well, that's a big question for another course. But at a very high level, a class can implement the iDisposable interface. Implementing the iDisposable interface means that a class must implement a dispose method, and inside that dispose method goes anything, but its intent is that it's used to clean up any resources that you're holding on to. Again, this could mean different things depending on what that class that you're creating that implements iDisposable is being used for, but generally it's intended to free up connections to resources, to external things like file systems and even web services, but then also internal things, references to other collections and classes. Now, why that's necessary requires a larger discussion of how resources are removed from memory by the garbage collector in the .NET runtime. You'll recall that the garbage collector may not immediately remove resources from memory at the time a reference for a given class goes out of scope. This is called indeterministic finalization. In other words, just because I say to kill yourself off, or just because I leave scope, doesn't mean at that instant that the garbage collector will kick in. It might take a while before the garbage collector comes around and then completely removes that out of memory. So while an object is sitting there waiting for garbage collection, it's possible that the resources that it's holding on to are still alive. So to prevent this, you can force garbage collection by implementing deterministic finalization, by implementing an iDisposable interface in your class with the dispose method, and then using it to let go of any of the resources. So when the last reference for a given class goes out of scope, the dispose method is called, and this is the opportunity for you, the developer, to forcibly shut down any connections to resources that you might still have open. Okay. So in this context, you might be asking, well, how does that work here? What does that mean? Well, it's used a little bit differently, but the idea is basically the same. The HTML.BeginFormHelper method returns an iDisposable object, and it allows you to wrap it in the C# using statement. And so when the using statement exits here, way at the bottom in line like 40, then the disposal method on that disposable object will call HTML.endForm automatically for us. So BeginForm will create the open form tag, and then endForm will call the /form, the closing form tag, automatically. And so it's just a nice convenience to wrap everything you're going to use inside of this using. Know that when we get to the bottom, this using statement what's inside will ultimately call endForm for us automatically when we hit this point. Whew! Okay, so it's a long story, but the result is rather simple. All it's doing is that it's going to emit a /form tag at the very bottom of our form. Okay, it's harder. It's one of those things that it looks harder than it really is. Okay, so at any rate, by default, the form tag, the begin form tag, right here will generate a form tag that will choose the current controller in action as the action attribute for this form. So usually you have a form method equals post, action equals /product/create. And so how it's getting that information is just because it's going to use the same name of the action that was used to show this create.cshtml in the first place. All right, so as we learned earlier, a request to the same action result method, the create action result method, which would actually then coordinate and show this create.cshtml page, would be routed to the version of the create action method that was adorned with the HTTP post attribute, like we learned about a couple lessons ago. And while that is the default functionality, it is possible to utilize one of BeginForm's other overloads. If you take a look at this, you can see that you can pass in route values, you can control the action name and the controller name. So you could post to away from the /product/create, or rather the create, the HTTP version of the create action method, and you could say go over to checkout / whatever, okay? As we look down here, we're going to skip the anti-forgery token. We'll spend a whole lesson on that, so let's just skip that. And we get down here to line number 19. We'll also skip the validation summary. We'll have a whole lesson on validation. But we'll take a look here at the HTML.label4 helper method. And you might be wondering, how is this different from HTML.displayNameFor, which was used back in the index.cshtml? And the basic difference is that the markup that happens around the actual value. In this case, the value will be product name, I think, because we added that data attribute. The display name for doesn't add any markup, and obviously the label for will add additional markup around the term product name. So if you want to take a look at this, let's go ahead and run the application. Oh, we're going to get an error here. Let's go ahead and go here and then here. And let's go to the create. And now if you take a look at the source, and we scroll down here, you can see here's the label control. Class equals control label, and then it uses some bootstrap classes for something called name. So it's going to use the for attribute, which will correspond with this input controls name, which will be at the very end here. The name is set to name. Okay, so it utilizes that attribute of an HTML5 label. And the difference is that if you use just the HTML.displayNameFor, it'll only print out that, not all the label code around it. Okay? That's the difference. But that does bring up a good point. Previously I said that you could just use the HTML.editFor and it will produce the default editor template for a given data type. And we haven't created a custom editor template yet, but we will. And while it's definitely one way to approach this at a more global level, you can create form controls at the view level like we did right here, or like is created for us in the create.cshtml with the label for and the I guess label for is the only one here. But you can use other similar types of helper methods to take control of what's emitted on a view-by-view basis. So there are a ton of different helper methods like checkbox and checkbox for, and drop-down list and drop-down list for, and there's a big long list here on screen right now. Enum drop-down list, hidden, label, list box, password, radio button, text area, text box. And even though I've listed a bunch of them here on this page, you'll notice that I skipped over a few methods that show up whenever you're in IntelliSense, like right now. And they basically follow the same pattern, but essentially those additional ones like, let's see, there's one called name for, and then there's also ID and ID for, and then there's also value and value for. Okay, and I didn't include them. There's also, as you saw probably as we were in there was something called name for model. Let's get back there. Name for model, there's value for model, there's label for model, and so on. And these again are used whenever we're working with display templates and editor templates, and we'll cover their usage in depth whenever we get it to that topic way near the end here. All right, but back to the matter at hand. We want to see these view level helper class, HTML helper class methods working. So what I want to do is actually just minimize this. I'm going to open up another project here that I've created called HTML helper methods, so that we can see more of these like label for, drop down list for type methods in action. As you can see, I've created most of this. I created a model called book and a manager class that will give us access to a list of books that I hard code here. So there's not a lot that's interesting about this, other than the fact that I do use a couple of enums, and those several of these have those data types, those enums. But let's go back. Then the home controller essentially is going to create a list of select list items, and these will be used for a drop-down list box, and we'll show you how that's used here in just a minute. But here we are in the index.cshtml, and so we're going to start by doing what we always do, and that is we're going to expect the the controller action result method to utilize or pass in a type of book, and then we'll display attributes of that book. So first of all, I'm going to go using HTML.beginForm, and this should work just fine the way that it is. However, I am going to use one of the overloads just to show you that I can set, for example, yeah, this is good, that I can take control of this process by saying I want you to post back to the action called index on the home controller, and I want you to use the form method post, like so. And then the next thing I'm going to do is create a text box for, you can see now I can specify that I want to use text box and not rely on the editor for template to do this for me. But I'm going to say I want to create it for a specific attribute of my view model called title, and I'm even going to pass in a new HTML attribute. We'll talk about these later, but I think I've already discussed how these can be used to style up and pass in. For example, in this case, I'm going to set the class attribute of the input named title. I'm going to set it equal to form control, which is used in Bootstrap in order to correctly render things to screen. Now, next I'm also going to add above that then a label for the same attribute of our view model. And then because I want this to look correct in Bootstrap, I'm going to need to surround this with a div, like so. I'm going to need to set the class on that div equal to form group in order to get this to look right. Alright, and then let me do this. I'm going to go down to the very bottom of this and just paste in an input control. Now you'll notice that when I do this, I am defaulting back to straight HTML5. There's no helper class that I know of that will generate an input, and essentially, why do we need one? I mean, it's not going to be working off specific data. It's only there so that you press it and submit the form. So there's no need to invoke anything on the HTML helper class. Now, let's go ahead and see what we have so far. I'm going to run the app. And you can see a nicely styled form. It could use a little bit of help here and there, but essentially we got what we're looking for. And let me get rid of this div because I think that's part of the problem. There. Okay, so we've already looked at the text box for it. Let me paste in another example here. And just want to compare that text box for to the editor for. And we'll do that with a property called copy sold, which is just going to accept an integer. How many copies have we sold so far? So now if you run the application, you'll see that the editor for template will blow away and it'll look completely different. It's because we're using just the vanilla edit for template, and we didn't rely on it to do, we haven't set it to style strings or integers in a specific way, so it just kind of plops down a very basic view. So that's why we're going to use text box 4 in this particular case. Now the next thing that I want to do is show the year published as a drop-down list, and so to do that I'm going to go HTML dot drop-down list 4, and then I'm going to say I want to do it for something called year published, and what I'll do here is just create a new select list right here in line. And so here I'm going to go new list of type object, and then I will go new text equals 2010, new text equals 2011. So you get the pattern. I'll just do this a couple times. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Now in addition to that, I'm going to give it the name of property in our new object that should be used for display and for the actual value for each object, and I'll show you how this is represented. But essentially, because we're using these anonymous objects, they only have one property. So we're going to say use the text property for display purposes and for value or behind the scene purposes. And then finally, I'm going to select a default value of 2015. And I could put those on different lines, but this will work just fine. And then the final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set the, I'm going to give it a, again, an HTML attribute of class equals, and we've done this before, form control. Now I'm not saying that this is the right way or a good way to do it, because you're going to get yourself confused pretty quickly here. But this definitely will work, and we'll show you how that works in just a second here. So let's go, let's add a label for, and we'll go p dot year published, and then we'll wrap this whole thing again with a div that will be the same as this div right here. So we're making a form group, a group of a label and a control. So now let's run the application and see how this is manifested. All right, so you can see here, it gives us that list of values. It's binding to the text property of these anonymous objects that make up of this list of drop-down list objects, right? And then if you take a look at the source, wish that message wouldn't pop up. Here we go. This is what's being created, a select input control with the class form control. You can see that there are some of these data dash star attributes that are used for unobtrusive JavaScript for the validation. And then the ID and the name, and then it starts with the options. Option value equals 2010, and then the display is 2010. So that's why we typed in the word text twice here in our code, because we're saying, hey, bind to that property for both of our purposes, behind the scenes and for display. And then you saw how it defaulted to 2015. Okay, so that's one way you can create a drop-down list. Let's go ahead and stop this. Show you another way here in just a minute. But the next thing I want to do is show you just how to create a list box. And this time what we're going to do is I'm going to actually take a look at the home controller. You can see that I put something in the view bag called categories. And categories is just a list of select list items with text and value. So classic, staff recommends this book, book club selection, or most popular. And then there's some sort of encoding, some sort of value that we actually would be saving in our database. Okay. And you know, this isn't a really good idea nowadays, but you know, old mainframe systems, they used to just use one character that represented and some notion or some idea. It's kind of like the modern day equivalent of enums. But what I want to do is actually now get that and put it here in my view bag. So you can see I'm grabbing it from view bag, the view bag.categories, and I'm making this into a list of select item. So now I have that in categories here. And then I'm just going to paste in the code to make this work, since you're kind of familiar now with the format. And I'll paste that in. And so you can see I create a label for, then a list box for, and I'm for the value category, but I'm going to give it the list values that are in that list of select list items that I brought in through the view bag, and then we're just going to style it up. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so there you go. We have just a few items, you can use them and show them all in a list box. Great. All right, the next one that I want to show you is also a little bit interesting. This goes back to the enum that we created earlier here for genre. And I have sci-fi, western, technical, and biography. And I said I have to set sci-fi equal to 1 so that it shows up correctly on the form. Unfortunately, the drop-down list for enum, if you set the default value equal to 0, you're not going to get what you want. So you either have to do one of two things. You're going to have to do sci-fi equals 1, or if you don't like that, then make genre nullable and then add the required attribute and it will work correctly. But I'll show you here. how this works, let's just go ahead and call on the enum drop-down list 4. And this is why I didn't want to use 0 as my starting point, because I want 0 to be the top item, which is choose 1. That'll be selected by default. You'll see how this is implemented here. Okay, and you can see genre choose 1, and then it displays all of the enum values from the genre. Now let's take this out for just a moment. I think we can get one of the overloads that just does that. And let's run it. Now technically this works, but it allows you to use nothing here. Let's actually get rid of this too. Let's get rid of the required and not make it nullable and run it. Okay, it defaults to sci-fi because it's the first in the list. That's not what we want. So I can set it again equal to 1 and see how that changes it. And again, that will change it. However, it's possible now to not select anything, and that's not the what we wanted here. So once again, here I'm just going to Control Z my way out of this. Put everything back where it belongs. Okay, I think we're good there. And then let's go here and Control Z our way out of that too. Okay. All right. So that's enum drop list 4. It allows you to use an enum as the list items for a drop-down list box. All right, let's take a look at checkbox, which is extremely simple. So this will be whether it's in stock or not. Just using checkbox 4, it's going to generate it out correctly. I didn't use any styling information, so let's see. Yeah, it doesn't look particularly nice, but I don't think I need to do much more than that, than to set its class equal to checkbox, and I think Bootstrap will do the rest for us. But the radio button is a different case, and you'll see that it's a pretty involved example here. In fact, this is probably the most difficult of all the things that we've done up to this point. And here I'm going to paste in all the code required. So availability, pickup, delivery, or reseller. And you'll notice that I am actually creating a label control, but I am calling into HTML helper methods.models.availability.reseller. So this would allow me to use one of the enums for availability as the name of both the radio button and the label for that radio button. But notice that I am inside of the radio button 4. I'm saying this is the field we want, this is the value that it represents, and then because label 4 is going to use the ID, I'm going to set that as well in the HTML attributes. And finally, or also I'm going to say I want this to be the default. So again, this is an HTML attribute for the input control, and I'll set the checked equals true, and then I'm also going to set the group name so that the radio buttons all are part of the same group. So this is a pretty complex example, but what it does is pretty simple. And you can see they're all represented in line. If you take a look at the source for this, you can see that how some of those things are actually utilized. The value, pickup, the type radio, the name, and the ID is pickup so that the label 4 can use that. And then checked equals true, group name, my group. Okay, so that's how that works. And we're getting near the end here. So let's go ahead and close that out. And the next thing that I want to look at is actually, or the last one, is the text area for. And this is for like a description or something large, and not only can I give it which field I want this to be used for, I can also specify how many rows, so 5 rows, and how many columns, 30 columns. Okay, and so let's run that. and now we're collecting information that's 5 columns or 5 rows and 30 columns. Okay. So again, I haven't used all of those HTML helper methods that we described or that I listed there, but this is the basic style of how you would use them on a view-by-view basis to style up specific input controls in your form. All right, so let's recap. In this lesson, we talked about HTML forms, about creating HTML forms for the edit and create scenarios, and we relied heavily on Razor and that HTML helper class to define the HTML form control for a given model property at the view level, not globally, as opposed to the model perspective, which would utilize the display for and the editor for methods. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks.